by name if available for those accessing through the web link. When speaking, please move to a quiet area. Please state your name and address at the beginning of your comments. Mix Kelly, do we have anybody in the queue for comment?
There are no current hands raised, Madam Chair.
Okay. All righty. Well, why don't we then move on to our main presentation tonight, which is the Downtown Ann Arbor Pandemic Impact and Recovery Report. We have a couple of folks from the DDA, and I, for one, am very interested to hear how this affected our downtown. So I will let you all take it away.
Thank you. Thank you all for giving us your time tonight. I'm Amber Miller. I oversee capital projects and planning with the DDA, and I am joined by my colleague, Shelby. Do you want to introduce yourself?
Hi, everyone. My name is Shelby Meestor. I'm a planning specialist for the DDA.
So I'm going to walk you through the presentation. Shelby helped compile it, helped compile the reports, and she's also going to help answer some questions tonight. So let me see if I can share my screen. Okay, is everybody seeing the full screen presentation? Okay, awesome. All right, so we're going to walk you through information from two sources. The first, and I believe you have both of these reports, you received them in your packet. So the first is the Downtown Market Scan. This report is created by Forward Planning. They've been creating this report for us since about 2014. We did take a pause during the peak of the pandemic to allow the data to really catch up with the new trends that were shifting quickly, but we have an update for you today. And then the second report is the COVID Impact and Recovery Report. So this report was created by DDA staff, mostly Shelby, to highlight the pandemic-related trends and DDA efforts. Before we jump in, I do want to note these are just a snapshot in time, and these are emerging trends. So we'll continue to track them, I think, through that tracking and also through your comprehensive plan efforts. We're going to get a better understanding of how downtown is evolving. So we're going to move through this fairly quickly. It's a lot of information, and then we'll jump into questions. All right, so before we dive into the data, for those who are not very familiar with the DDA, I just want to give you a really quick overview. Our mission is to undertake public improvements that have the greatest impact in strengthening downtown. As a result, we mostly focus on value-driven infrastructure investments to meet this mission. You can see the boundaries on your screen there. You're probably familiar with those. They align with your D1 and D2 zoning. Prior to the pandemic, downtown was active and thriving most hours of the day. Our population growth was fairly strong in the 10 years leading up to the pandemic. You can see from the top chart on your screen there that downtown Ann Arbor is growing at a faster rate than the city or MSA as a whole, but not quite as quickly as some other university towns. The number of jobs was staying fairly steady from 2010 to 2019, but we were seeing a pretty significant shift in the types of jobs. So between 2010 and 2019, we saw about a 44% increase in information and tech jobs. And overall, prior to the pandemic, we had a little over 13,000 jobs downtown. And I do think it's important to acknowledge that these trends were not positive for all people. Most of the residential growth was occurring in the upper income categories. You can see that in the chart on your screen too. So public funding was and still is needed to support affordable housing downtown. With the start of the pandemic, we saw downtown activity decrease dramatically. Starting with the governor's declaration of a state of emergency in March 2020, and closures and restrictions came in quick succession. And to understand the pandemic impact in our recovery, it helps to understand some key downtown economic factors. So this relates back to those pre-pandemic trends. Compared to similar downtowns, Ann Arbor has a high density of primary workers, but the lowest residential density. So you can see that in the upper chart there. Our residential population is not large enough to support downtown retail and restaurant on its own. We've historically relied on those 13,000 office workers and visitors help support downtown businesses. And you get a little sense of the scale of that in that lower chart. So the orange color there is businesses per 1,000 workers. And then the lighter color is businesses per 1,000 population. So you can see how our density of businesses is more aligned with workers than it is with residents. And when you look at the other downtowns, those two columns are quite a bit closer together. With U of M as an anchor destination, we'll likely always have businesses that are supported by those who live outside of downtown to some degree. But one message you're going to see in both of the reports is that having more downtown residents will help to improve resilience. As expected, downtown visits declined dramatically at the start of the pandemic. The upper chart there is Google mobility data, helping to track trends from a baseline of pre-pandemic. And you can see that visits to workplace and retail immediately decreased by about 60 to 70%, and overall decreased by about 53% for the year following the pandemic. Parking and transit ridership followed similar trends. For streets that we have the data for, walking remained fairly stable and bike ridership grew. So those that lived close enough to walk and bike were helping to keep downtown active during this time. And during this time of reduced activities, limits on indoor operations, we worked with our partners at the city and the business community to create space for business operations and encourage activity downtown. This is just a sample of those efforts. Starting with the first round of vaccines, we moved into pandemic recovery. And for downtown, the pace of that recovery really started picking up with the return of students and the rescinding of the remaining emergency orders. So as we move into recovery, in addition to residents helping to activate downtown, we start to see the return of U of M activities and visitors. And at the start of the pandemic, businesses that were agile and able to pivot were able to survive, and some even thrive. And today, we're seeing many restaurants operate under a new normal, some focused hours and focused offerings, and they're finding success with that approach. U of M students returned in record-breaking numbers. Tourism took a pretty significant hit at the start of the pandemic. So hotel occupancy was only about 37% in 2020. The 2022 numbers haven't been released yet, but what we're hearing is that they've nearly returned to pre-pandemic numbers. So overall, we're starting to see some positive trends in downtown activity. Also overall, office workers have been slow to return to downtown. And we think that this is a trend that is likely to continue. Downtown has a high share of primary workers in office-based industries. And if you can see both the charts on your screen, there are national trends. The top one is tracking, and in my view, it's really small, but the top one is tracking occupied office space. That's the darker green line. And the lighter green line that for most of that chart is lower, that's tracking office employment. So, and the chart is from 2000 through to 2022. So historically, office occupancy tracks with office employment. But when you start to look at the pandemic years and even what we're calling recovery, you can see that that trend totally flips. As office employment in office-based industries continues to rise, office vacancy occupied office space continues to decline. And then in the lower chart there, this is from a national Gallup poll. And you can see pre-pandemic, the majority of workers being fully on site, and anticipated post 2022, the majority of workers being hybrid or exclusively remote. And we're starting to see that in downtown Ann Arbor as well. Office vacancies increased pretty dramatically during the pandemic. Vacancy rates increased from about 5.7% in 2019 to 15 to 32% in 2022, depending on the source of information. And we might see that continue to rise as office leases come up for renewal. And the mobility trends continue to align with the recovery trends. So again, we're showing that Google mobility map. And you can see the top line, the green line, retail visits to retail and recreation. Those have, for the most part, continued to rise. Right now, they're about 12% below pre-pandemic levels. But the visits to workforce have stayed fairly constant at about 42% below pre-pandemic levels. Parking data is tracking similarly. So that chart is showing one day at the Maynard parking structure, pre-pandemic and 2023. The orange color is the pre-pandemic. The blue color, which for the most part is that lower line, is 2023. You can see that the gap, the difference between the two is quite a bit more significant in the daytime and in the lunch hour. But in the evening, that gap starts to close. And in some cases, we're even seeing more evening activity in 2023 than we were pre-pandemic. And then throughout all of this, bike ridership has continued to increase. So we think that we're possibly starting to see some mode shift or people coming downtown just to recreate. And that's a trend we're trying to understand more. We have some surveys planned for people using the bikeways, and we're also installing permanent counters. Okay, so overall, we're seeing positive trends emerge from the pandemic, but we still have more work to do. So where do we go from here? And even as we were recovering from the pandemic, we knew that we'd be facing other shocks and stressors. And the pandemic highlighted the crucial importance of building resilience. So some pandemic effects remain. They're being compounded by economic factors like labor shortages and inflation. And all the while, we've been facing a climate emergency, with climate-related events becoming more extreme and more frequent, housing shortages and affordability challenges, and aging infrastructure and rising costs. And Forward Planning conducted some case studies of other university downtowns, and based on that, they had some key findings. The first being support more residential. And you'll see in the Forward Planning report that this recommendation is dependent on having the right policies in place to require developers to participate in infrastructure costs. And we do have those policies in place in Ann Arbor. There are other findings: diversify downtown activities and purpose, increase walkability, enable housing diversity and affordability, build social and cultural equity into the plan, and nourish the economy through partnerships. For downtown Ann Arbor in particular, we're starting from a strong place. So we have adaptable, resilient businesses. We saw that throughout the pandemic. We also have continued demand for residential and tourism, and we're starting from a strong foundation. So collectively, we've made smart infrastructure investments, and we're working towards more engaging public spaces. Because of those strengths, we have opportunities to build on them. Expanding the purpose of downtown and diversifying the daytime economy go hand in hand. Overall, we just need more reasons for people to be downtown. We want the downtown experience to continue to be enjoyable. So ensure that downtown's more than an office center, support recreation, diversify the job sectors, and increase the residential population. In order to do this, we're being encouraged to re-examine codes and policies to support adaptive reuse and also ensure that downtown zoning is feasible. And they pointed that out, particularly related to the premiums and wanting us to understand that we can't get what we want out of the zoning if a developer can't make the project work financially. So that's just consideration. And then continue supporting a high quality of life. So continue supporting affordable housing, continue infrastructure and public space investments, and ensure that all have access to downtown. And luckily for all of us, these opportunities are not for any one department or agency to solve alone. The DDA has a role, planning has a role, We have strong public sector partners. We have business partners in our Downtown Merchant Association, Spark, and others. And we can work together to help make downtown more resilient. And as we wrap up here, just briefly touch on what the DDA is specifically committed to. So we're taking on some studies to continue our commitment to resilient and adaptable infrastructure. You are probably familiar with our people-friendly streets projects. We're looking to build on those projects. And we have a planning effort coming up to look at opportunities to connect the bikeways to recreation, the river, and neighborhoods, and continue to increase outdoor space for people shopping, dining, and attending events, and prioritizing transit downtown. We're also committing to continuing to invest in replacing undersized and old water mains, installing stormwater infrastructure to help enhance resiliency to disruptive events. In addition, we're working with the City Office of Sustainability and Innovations on a solar and geothermal assessment for downtown. We want to help activate these spaces that we're creating and provide some needed amenities. So we're looking at things like public restrooms, public art, improved street closure equipment, and the platform dining program. And we're also committed to continue supporting affordable housing. So we recognize that this is something that the market is not supporting on its own. With 121 East Catherine and 350 South Fifth Ave, we're installing the underground utilities to support the Housing Commission's plan development and providing direct grant support. Both of those help to reduce their costs, but also help make them more competitive for federal funding. And that is our presentation for today. So I will stop speaking now, turn it over to you all to ask questions. I can leave the presentation up if we want to be able to go back to earlier slides, or I can close it if we just want to be able to see one another's faces more clearly.
Why don't we leave it up for a bit? And if people have some kind of data questions and things like that, and then if we seem to be moving away from that, we can close it down so we can see each other. Any hands? People have questions or comments? Go ahead, Sarah, or Commissioner Mills.
Thanks. Thanks for that, Amber. I guess I'm gonna dive right into one of the things that you mentioned. It was a few slides back. You talked about like what can be done, and one was support additional housing, and you made a comment about, in passing, about something that you said we have supportive policies to do that. And I think it was about like a diversity of types or something like that. And can you go back to that? And that's obviously the thing that I'm thinking a lot about. So I'm curious if you can give us some more detail there.
Yeah, so I think this is the slide you were talking about, and it's called out in more detail in Forward Planning's report. So what they said was support more residential, essentially, if you have the right policies in place so that the public or the city isn't having to take on significant infrastructure costs. So like bake those policies into development requirements. And they did point out that Ann Arbor has those policies in place. And Shelby, do you remember which of the cities did not have those policies in place?
Yeah, it was State College, Pennsylvania. And so they had seen a surge of higher density without policies to protect against those or mitigate the impact of the cost increase on the city. And so, yes, it was State College, and they were reevaluating some of their policies while the study was actually going on.
So I believe they said like their water and sewer system were overtaxed. So they didn't do some of that groundwork that we have done here in Ann Arbor.
Perfect. That's so it's not zoning, it's all of the other things that are put into development proposals, and it's not just downtown, it's everywhere. So okay. Thanks.
Could I add on to that? I would just say that with my other hat on of somebody who does site design and things like that, that is often a big stumbling block for developments, is that, you know, you have an existing old 6-inch water main or whatever, and you have to upsize it to a 12-inch, and it's a huge cost, and it just means that projects don't happen. So it's a real balancing act too, in terms of how you can pull those things off, because there's a bunch of things we just never even see because it just doesn't pencil out because of what the city does ask. And so, like, if you look at ours compared to some other cities, we are insanely high compared to some other comparable cities in terms of like what our tap fees are and, you know, things like that. So, which all contribute to us keeping up with our infrastructure. But I feel like we don't have a great fine-tuned sense of where that really needs to be able to still kind of support the city, but also make it more viable to be able to have development downtown. And I feel like we are erring, personally, from my side, erring on the side of putting it on developers. You know, I don't know if any other folks on Planning Commission that have experience with that. I'm sure Commissioner Sauvé, you probably have some opinions about that too, I would imagine. So that's a tricky one because it protects the city, but it also means that we're not seeing some things that we want to see as well. So, yeah.
Yeah, so we might be on the other end of the spectrum from State College. And in the DDA district in particular, with DDA projects, we're trying to upsize the water mains and prepare that infrastructure in advance of development to help kind of reduce that burden.
Yeah, and it just hasn't happened all over the DDA, right? You know, so
Not
it's like,
quite yet. We're
yeah,
getting there,
right.
but not yet.
So it's like there's places where it's not. So, thanks, Commissioner Dish.
There, I'm unmuted. Okay. Thank you. This is a very rich, actually pretty packed full presentation. So I was moving through the PDF that you sent us and listening to you speak so I could try to keep up with all that you said. I am cheered to hear, I am cheered because I know that you have been helping to construct utility infrastructure for the affordable housing projects. And I'm glad to hear that you want to continue to do that. I notice also that you call out supporting sustainable, reliable energy, e.g. solar and geothermal. So as you invest in utility infrastructure for some of the affordable housing projects, will you be, are you going to put a focus on researching the viability of geothermal and helping to support the city's move in that direction?
Yeah, so this summer, we're working with the Office of Sustainability and Innovation to do essentially a location assessment of where can we locate solar and geothermal in the downtown. And then the intent is to install that with capital projects.
Wow.
Our 4th Avenue project is getting a little bit ahead of the study. So we're planning improvements on 4th Ave between William and Liberty to serve the Housing Commission's project there, and also Blake. Because it's happening in advance of the study, we're saving some space for geothermal so that we have the opportunity to bake that in once the study's done. Okay,
That's great. So one thing that I didn't see anywhere explicit in your presentation, but that from the work that I've been doing with staff in solid waste, is support for BIPOC entrepreneurship. And we're, the solid waste team has really been working to build out strategy 5 of the 820 plan, and that's the circular economy. And it would be, I mean, it would be a dream come true if some of the things that, some of the space that opened up because of the pandemic and because of the business failures would be taken as an opportunity zone to assist local entrepreneurs and first-time entrepreneurs in opening businesses downtown. Because as we diversify through the housing that we are building. It's really important to diversify our retail and not have all the retail pitched at students and, you know, sporting clothes shops and, you know, nice, you know, high-end retail, but stuff that frankly, I don't even really shop in because I'm not a recreational shopper. And it would be really cool to see a broader range of restaurants and to see some interesting retail that would come from, you know, that I can't even imagine what it would be, but that would be proposed by local entrepreneurs who have ideas for things that would appeal to a different market and possibly also, you know, people like me who are not going to go and buy a expensive leather bag or something like that.
Mhm. Yeah, so I think some of that diversity follows housing. So, you know, as I said in the presentation, right now, because our housing skews, because our downtown skews towards a workforce and visitors, our retail and restaurants skew that way too. So as we get more residents, then our retail and restaurants can better serve that market. And for the most part, we focus on infrastructure. We do have some grant programs. And I am actually talking this week, the Grand Rapids DDA has a program to provide a grant to encourage minority-owned businesses. So I've reached out to them to understand how that's working for them and understand how that might fit within our development plan.
Thank you very much for researching that topic with Grand Rapids. Because I think that it's really important to provide that kind of economic support, and it's hard to see where the city would have the funds to do that. So I really appreciate your efforts in that direction.
Commissioner White.
Hi, Donnell White. Thanks for the presentation and the attachments in our packet. I spent some time this week looking through them, and I had a couple of questions or maybe an invitation to say a little bit more about what was reported. So I want to start with the Ann Arbor downtown market dashboard that the forward planning folks put together for you. So starting on page 5, their high level recommendations from a policy standpoint are to build more housing in downtown Ann Arbor to ensure its vibrancy. And so I wondered if you could speak a little bit more to that. So if we jump down into the report, they have a specific set of recommendations that sort of look at you trying to capture somewhere between 15 and 20% of new housing starts to be in the downtown. I think this is on page 13, and that they were speaking to the fact that the sort of the density issue. So there's like all these things at work, right? So COVID occurs, the landscape for office workers change, our vacancy rates for commercial increase, right? They go from whatever it was, 5-6% to now like 12-13% vacancy. But some of the floor plates, if I got that term correct, for those commercial spaces can't be converted very easily into housing. So you can't take these pre-existing, pre-built structures and accomplish what needs to be accomplished, which is basically to get more people to be downtown, either workers, so that we can support something that Commissioner Dish talked about at our meeting last week, which is as we do all this development, we don't want to lose our restaurants and especially our local restaurants. But I'm understanding that like some 3,000 employees have left downtown, which now makes it hard for restaurants to thrive because they don't have any foot traffic for lunch. And so then they're trying to make everything work in an environment that's hard. So I think specifically my question is, what can we be looking at on planning commission to make it easier for you to realize the recommendation from forward planning to achieve their recommendations of somewhere between, I think it's like 690 and 930 new apartments in the downtown in the next 4 years, because that feels a bit aggressive, especially if they're not high density developments.
Yeah, so, and remember, this report is fairly high level. They have not done a deep dive into policies. We could certainly have them do that. But for now, it's kind of a deep level, or sorry, high level overview. And I would say the biggest recommendation that they had that applies to you all is re-examining the zoning code to ensure the density bonus is economically feasible. So, make sure if we want density and we want the good things that we're asking for in the premiums, make sure the premiums are structured in a way that it can pencil out for a developer. And their initial thinking in looking at the way that's structured today is that it can't do that, or not very easily. And recently, Shelby and I were in a meeting with the developers of the credit union site. And I think they're the first project to come in that's taking advantage of those premiums. So we asked them about that. And their response was they felt that student housing was the only project type that could support what was being asked for in premiums. It's the only housing type that could absorb that extra cost.
So can I ask a follow-up question? I have a second question, but a follow-up to what you just said. Is that okay?
Sure,
Chair
yeah,
Gibran?
go ahead.
Okay. So I think my question is it the DDA's position that you want more density downtown? I think I'm hearing that, but I just want to make sure it's like I'm not reading something into what you're presenting that is not your actual goal.
So I will say that we haven't taken a policy position, but really relying on best practices for what makes a successful downtown. And at this point, the evidence is pointing towards more residents downtown helps to support businesses and create a more vibrant downtown.
Okay. I think it would be helpful when you all are ready to share that as a policy decision to just say, hey, if we want our downtown to continue to thrive and be vibrant, then that's going to mean the sort of the makeup of the downtown has to match the current reality. So prior to COVID, we were achieving that with workers downtown. Post-COVID, remote work is in play. So the way that we might achieve that is with housing density. And so then, thank you. So I just wanted to make sure I was understanding that. Go ahead.
And I'm sorry, as you're talking,
No.
I'm realizing we haven't taken a recent policy stance, but in our development plan renewal in 2003, that does state a purposeful goal of increasing residential downtown.
Okay.
So the answer to
So
your
then,
question is yes.
So it's yes. Is that what you're saying?
Yes.
Okay, great. Great. I want more residents downtown too. So I'm glad to hear that that is a part of your near-term vision. So I think I have like 3 sort of questions, and you can pick whichever one and give someone else a chance to talk. So I'll just give them to you. So one, it seems like the affordable housing incentive as a part of the D1 is harming the ability for residential development to occur in the downtown. Is that, I see that in this report, is that also your understanding? And then I'll preface that also with, I sat in on the Downtown Advisory Commission's meeting, their April 4th meeting. I watched it, and they had some developers come, and the developers talked about the fact that asking developers to build the affordable housing seems to be the wrong way to achieve the affordable housing, and that those developers were saying it would be better suited in a TIF or some other kind of structure to get the affordable housing. So I wondered, are you all having those same conversations, and are you coming to the same conclusions? Because we're right in the midst of a conversation at planning that is reevaluating the incentives in the D1. And so I personally would have appreciated your conversation before our meeting with the consultants last week, so that we could bring this conversation into that, but that's not how it went. So yeah, thoughts about that, the TIF, or that it's a sort of a flawed policy of the city to ask developers to build this affordable housing, and we should remove it from our incentive structure.
Sure. So I think that there are people that have more expertise than myself that can kind of weigh in on your first question, including forward planning. But my understanding of what forward planning is saying is that as it's structured today, it's not working as we intended. That doesn't mean that some level of affordable housing premium couldn't work, but as it's structured today, it's probably not very viable. And then to your question about TIF, we are using TIF to incentivize affordable housing, but our focus has been on using TIF to incentivize or to support the housing commission's affordable housing, because we know that that is well managed and purposeful housing.
Okay. And then the other thing you talked about was the reduction in car traffic into the DDA and parking. And I wonder, have you all decided to maybe respond to that in any structural way? Because there's like a Ann Arbor Twitter bot that counts the number of open spaces every day. And I think the average is somewhere north of 4,000 open parking spots pretty much every day in the DDA, which means that's space that's being dedicated to car storage that could be repurposed. And I wonder, in your capitals projects plan, is there a vision to reduce the amount of downtown parking or repurpose it so that we can achieve some of the density that you're looking for, since the commercial space doesn't necessarily allow for those floor plates to be converted to residential?
Sure. Yeah, that evaluation is ongoing, but the Housing Commission is looking at many of the surface kind of publicly managed sites.
I'm sorry sorry to interrupt you, not the surface lots. I'm aware of all of those. I'm talking about the parking structures, because many of those sit empty as well throughout the day.
So right now, our focus has been on repurposing the lots first and foremost.
Okay.
And then I think that we'll see how trends evolve over time. And certainly from our perspective, parking is just a tool to meet our overall mission. So if at some point it's better for downtown to think about repurposing those, we would certainly consider that.
All right. And then my last question for now was about the increase of biking. So I'm one of those bikers that uses the bikeway. I used it today. I almost got hit today because drivers are not always paying attention. So I was crossing a cut through, or a curb cut. The driver was looking left. I was coming from their right. They didn't look right until they decided to go out into traffic, where, guess what? I was waiting for them because I stopped. And then they're like, oh no, I'm sorry, I just saw you. So I wonder, in what ways are you all either hardening our infrastructure to make it less possible for cars to harm pedestrians and bikers? Or is that something that you haven't looked at yet, or is it on your plan? I'm talking about like actual bollards, not the flexible ones, like the steel ones that have footings, so that if a car hits it, the car is the thing that loses, not me, because I can't absorb the impact of a 2-ton vehicle and live. But a car, they'll have to get a new one. So like, are there any plans to do that? And I would say all throughout the bikeway, I continue to contend with cars parked in the bikeway, with people parked in the bikeway, I had a vehicle come down the bikeway while I was in the bikeway. And I know you have put in some of those dividers to make it more obvious to people, but anything that can be done to harden that infrastructure to make it so that cars lose and that humans don't. And I don't know if you've been paying attention, but in the last 3 months, we've had a surge of pedestrian incidents or cars hitting pedestrians in our city, all across the city. And so, especially as more people are coming downtown by your own data on the bikeways, I would really love to know what the plan is around that. So,
Yeah,
thanks.
so the first separated bikeway that we installed downtown was on William Street, and that was entirely delineator separated. So those are those plastic bollard looking things that you're referring to. We have since retrofitted the William Street, most of the William Street bikeway, and then installed all of our subsequent bikeways downtown with concrete curb separation. So now those bikeways have the same separation that the sidewalk does from the street. And there are some parts of William Street bikeway that still have those plastic delineators. That is to accommodate the art fair. So those get removed during the art fair every year and then reinstalled. To your question about vehicles parking in the bike lane, that is definitely an issue. So we cost shared with the city to help purchase smaller bikeway cleaning equipment that will allow us this summer to go in and install many more dividers to make it very physically challenging for people to do that. The other thing we're doing with all of our projects is trying to slow traffic so that any incidences are less severe. And this is something that, you know, has been interesting since the pandemic. With the vehicle volumes going down, speeds can go up. So that's just something that we need to continue to work towards, is kind of right sizing our streets for the amount of vehicle traffic.
Commissioner Sauvé.
I was going to bring this one up, but since Commissioner Weich did, just kind of very briefly, I've been reading reports about EVs being heavier and the challenges of parking structures and engineering. So it would be interesting, both in terms of strategies, if there are any new parking decks, if we do them horizontally, so that we have flat floors for adaptive reuse instead of sloped. Europe's been doing it for a while because they're forward thinking, and we're going to have a lot of obsolete parking decks or a lot of blocked off parking spaces that we spent money on. I actually I don't know if or when you have this data that between staff could be kind of interpolated, but a couple of things that I'm thinking about that would be really helpful to be able to extrapolate from the downtown is one, how can we get to the assessed value per resident in a density to understand the kind of tax contribution of downtown properties to, the linear amount of feet of sewer system that the infrastructure is getting updated versus a whole bunch of single family homes tax contribution to X linear feet of sewer and waterway systems. So seeing some of those ratios be really helpful to understand where density might, help collectively pay for some of those things. And really what I'm thinking about is TC1 with both of that and things like the ratios. What we're seeing is we're unbalanced right now, and we need more residential to support the small businesses. And we've got too much office, which means we've got workers instead of residents. And it makes me think of our current TC1 policy and the amount of ground floor retail we require at intersections, that 100-foot length. And if it's over requiring an amount of commercial square footage to our ratio of residential, if we only require a minimum of 2 stories. And then, just to the adjacent of TC1, we have a bunch of single family. So my concern is that our policy on seeing this here is that we may overbuild the wrong ratio with new policies trying to incentivize kind of neighborhood downtowns versus kind of our central downtown. So if there's a way to give like help extrapolate and work with staff on rules of thumb, so we can help make policy decisions citywide, I think that would be really helpful from an ordinance kind of development perspective. I know I'm just like giving homework more than questions, but I'm like inspired by how many tools and information there is to kind of have. Here's a question though. In the partners that you outlined with all those green dots, the historic district wasn't part of it. And is that because we forgot them or that we don't see them as a beneficial partner? Are they actually a restricting partner when it comes to some of these downtown goals in terms of increasing residential adaptability of buildings to different uses? Like there's several historic districts in the DDA. Why are they not a partner? And how can we make them a partner?
Yeah, I mean, I think, one thing for you all to be aware of is this is not an all-encompassing list of partners. And historic districts could be considered as part of city planning. And that just was not something that we really looked at with this report, I have to say.
Okay. I think it would be helpful to because we talked about these with premiums too, and that there's currently like a small historic premium. I got a degree in conservation, and I'll be the first one to tell you that I don't think historic preservation is a helpful tool. So I've been there. I've got the Habs archived architecture at the Library of Congress. Tell me if I care if we save that building or not. No. But yeah, I am really seeing like the tap fees, which really triggered the kind of idea of the assessed value and the taxable value that we see is a recurring income stream for what we see in development. But if it doesn't get built, we never get that boost in property taxes. And those are the kind of through lines financially. I want to see what the front end burden is versus the lost opportunity cost of both being able to house more neighbors and have new income streams to update our infrastructure. So I'm not sure if you guys are tracking that or if there's ways to reconcile between some of these reports and other things, but downtown, I mean, you guys just have such a rich amount of data that it would be really helpful to kind of see some of those pieces in a different format.
Yeah, I do think that we've looked at that before. And I think with the information that the city has on their infrastructure, that it wouldn't be too hard to at least get at the first piece that you're talking about. I think
Okay.
Specific formulas for ratios might be a little bit harder. And part of that is because they're changing. Like our ratio for successful office to residential probably look different than what we're gonna find our way to. But I can reach back out to forward planning to see if they have some kind of initial guidance on that.
Yeah, even some rules of thumb on where they're seeing the trend going. So we can kind of, mock up a couple of blocks over on West Stadium and be like, what ratio would you get in the best and the worst scenario? I think would be really helpful. Kind of scenario planning to do to kind of test the policies in this as well. Great. Those are all. I really appreciate it. Thank you.
Anybody else? Commissioner Lee.
Thank you. Real quick, this is just for my edification. Are there efforts to diversify DDA revenue funding? I know there's a large reliance on parking. We talked a lot about parking, and obviously it's gone down. So are there efforts in that respect?
So actually the primary funding tool for the DDA is tax increment financing. That's TIF.
Yep.
That's what funds all of our public infrastructure investments. The parking system revenues fund the parking system and the transit pass for downtown employees. So we keep those two systems separate.
Okay.
There are other funding mechanisms that are allowed to DDAs. Ours, specifically in Ann Arbor, is restricted due to city code. So some DDAs can leverage a millage, we cannot. In 2017, City Council actually voted to cap the DDA's revenue. So our revenues only grow at 3.5%. And the tax revenues are growing significantly higher, at a significantly higher rate than that. So that does limit the investment and the impact that we can have downtown.
Okay, gotcha. That's really helpful. Thank you for the
Mhm.
clarification.
Anybody else? I have a follow-up comment on the biking piece. I find that the protected bike lanes are good if you are just going straight for a long period of time. They're really, really counterintuitive for bikers and for drivers when they're shoved on one side of the road, especially like at Division, where it suddenly leaves the DDA. And then you have bikers that are in that bike lane going the opposite direction of cars, which is like without any protection, which is just kind of alarming, you know, on many levels for many people. And I get it that it's like the kind of perfect scenario in terms of protecting bikers, but sometimes I just wonder if it's kind of like in Detroit where you have the plastic bollards just on either side and there's separation and it's more intuitive because you're moving with traffic. And I'm wondering in that process of deciding how you all have been doing this in the DDA, that if you looked at some of those different scenarios, because, you know, sometimes I'm going from end to end, but many times I'm turning and I just feel like it's confusing for a lot of people. And especially as a biker, you're moving more quickly. And so people don't necessarily see you coming. And if you could just talk more about how you all arrived at that decision, and is it something that feels like you're still kind of in the middle of figuring out, or is it, and you're just kind of testing things, or is like, no, after a lot of thinking and a lot of, you know, different scenarios in different places, this is what we arrived at. Like, just tell me how you all got there.
Yeah, so the first thing I'll say is consider Division Street a phase one, like in general, that street needs continued care to get it to really what it should be. And, you know, eventually, and this is what we're looking at with this study, that's a great connection point to carry over the Broadway Bridge or to connect to the river. So, you know, we do have kind of broader intentions with that bikeway. And I'm trying to think back to our bikeway projects, but we did look at that. We looked at those options. And we chose the two-way for a couple of reasons. One, some streets it was just space constraints. And there really wasn't enough space to provide protection on both sides of the street and have it on both sides of the street. Some of it was based on data that our consultant team, particularly Tool Design, and they've been kind of leading the industry in some of the design standards for separated bike lanes. So in looking at the data, they were making recommendations for two-way on some streets based on destinations and where people were likely to be going. And then I think, you know, based on my understanding of safety trends is that the two-way bikeways are proven to be just as safe as the one-way separated bikeways on both sides of the street. So I think we just have more work to do to help the community understand how to enter and exit the bikeways. And then we are capturing safety data and we'll have some of that to share in an upcoming report. But overall, we're seeing positive trends both in ridership and safety.
Yeah, some sort of, I don't know if it's signage at intersections or something. And the tricky part about Ann Arbor too is that we get so many visitors. And that's been actually my experience when I am knocking on the window of the people that are in the bike lane in their car, which I've done several times. I'm seeing Commissioner White has endeavored to do the same thing. They have been like a delivery person from out of town or somebody visiting from out of town. And we're going to have a baseline of those people no matter what we do, because we are the university and because we are a job center. So somehow it's educating, you know, whatever the 70% of us that are down there that live here, but there's a decent chunk of people that don't live here and that don't come here all the time. And how do we translate those places that are just counterintuitive for how, so people know what to do and know what to look for without it being completely overwhelming and you know, too much information. But I think it's a real challenge. And even though, again, I part of me feels like the perfect protected bike lane like we have is almost a little bit the perfectest enemy of the good. That is like, yes, you're completely protected from a car like jumping over that big curb, but it also just makes it confusing too. So I guess I'm just putting in my 2 cents on that as it relates to the downtown, as a biker, as a regular biker, and just the insecurity I feel at the points where I'm jumping off. So it's just, I guess, put it in the hopper of the feedback that you're getting around all of that as you all continue to make decisions around that, because I have found sometimes in other places where it's a smaller separation, not as robust, not a curb, not all that kind of thing, but it's going with traffic and it just has like the bollardy kind of thing. But somehow I feel like it's easier, you know, for cars and for people, even though we're not as quote protected in terms of the infrastructure there. So I guess take it for what it's worth. That's my 2 cents. As more as an individual than as, you know, planning commission, whatever, you know, that it's something that I struggle with, and it's something that I see other people are struggling with too. Commissioner Clark.
Yeah, just kind of along a similar line. I guess I just was curious about pedestrian interaction with some of the protected bike lanes, and like just make sure it's intuitive. I've just recently started walking where like South First across from Blank Slate and West Liberty all meets. And I was a bit taken back by how the turning radius is really wide, and then you kind of, it's in like, I guess just consistency with the other intersections. So it introduced like, you know, the red little square, which I've like taught my kid never go past the little red square thing, is much further back from the curb, and then there's no, it's just kind of sloped into it. So like the joining of the road to the lane is kind of unclear. And I'm curious, in other cities, sometimes they'll have a pedestrian island where you walk across the bike lane and then you wait for the signal to change and then you go. And I was just curious about like, and I guess more comment, you know, building up what Shanker Randall is like with visitors and new drivers coming to town. I mean, kind of making sure we're designing for the least competent possible driver to keep everyone safe, and making sure everything is like consistent, and then just not having wide turning radiuses around there. But yeah, that's just wanted to add on that with the pedestrians as well as the bike lane interaction.
Yeah, and some of it's unique to the intersection, and certainly Liberty and First is a unique intersection there. Overall, our emphasis has been on slowing travel speeds so that even as people are trying to navigate things, or we have people from out of town that aren't familiar, they're moving at a slow enough pace that the risk is much lower. And that has been our overall emphasis and push to improve safety.
Anybody else? I guess I also have a question for Mix Kelly. Did Carla Wortman, were they privy to these reports and things as they were putting together their own presentation for us? Like, have they been involved in any of this, or is there any way for us to kind of get this over to them so that as they are making recommendations to us with premiums, that they can be building on the foundation of this work?
That's a good question, and I can't say definitively that they have. I know that they are currently doing stakeholder outreach, and I'm sure that the DDA is on their list. They haven't reached out already, so we can facilitate that if it hasn't already occurred.
Yeah, and I can add to that a little bit. We did give them an early draft copy of the forward planning report so that they had access to that when they started looking at that information.
Great. Okay, so they're in the loop. They may need to be, you know, refreshed or whatever, but it's not like they've been divorced from this process. I'm glad to hear that because they're just so intertwined. Yeah. Anybody else? Okay, thank you all so much for coming. It was really interesting. It's really important for us to hear the trends and the data that you all have brought to us. So we really appreciate you getting on our agenda as we are both thinking about development in the downtown. And then I think, especially as Commissioner Sauvé was talking about, thinking about how we can kind of translate some of this sense of downtown to some of these TC1 areas, and making sure that we're kind of thinking big picture around that as we are doing long-term planning for how we densify other areas of our cities. Really important work. So thank you for coming and for facilitating this whole process. I think it's just super important to understand not only what happened, but how it's shaping our future too with this, which is clear. I think the other thing that's a little sobering is, the chart that we got from them last week, which I don't know if you've seen or not, but is that the D1 and D2 areas, a good chunk of them are in floodplain or our historic district. And so in terms of these zones that we have to get, 680 units in the next 4 years, not a lot of places we can do that, so it's really helpful for us to see some kind of hard numbers around some of that and transposed over the information that we got last week from them. So keep up the good work, and we look forward to any other things that keep evolving out of this. So thanks for coming.
Great, thank you all for having us. And I know it was a lot of information. So if you have questions, feel free to send them our way or pass them through planning staff, and we can get back to you.
Yeah, thank you, everyone.
Great. Unless there's any other comments from folks, just kind of internally within us, I'm moving on to public comment. Anybody else have any, things for our own team in terms of responses, or? Looks like we're good. Okay. We will move on to our last opportunity for public comment. To speak to the commission, press *9 if listening by phone, or use the raise hand feature if viewing through the web link. For phone access, call 877-853-5247 and enter meeting ID 977-6634-1226. To unmute, press *6. City staff will select callers that have raised their hand using the last 3 digits of your phone number or by name if available. For those accessing through the web link, please go to a quiet place and state your name and address at the beginning of your comments. Do we have anybody in line? Mix Kelly.
We do not.
Wow, I think this is a first for a while that we've had a meeting with 0 public comment at the beginning or the end. Okay, well, at 8:06, I think we are moving on to adjournment. So everybody enjoy your evening with the little bit of light that we have left. I don't think we need a motion or vote on it or anything. So I think we're out of here. Bye.